Ilan Journo here at the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm joined today by Jacob Mchangama, a lawyer and writer who's commented extensively on freedom of speech, particularly in Europe. He's written on those topics for many leading publications, including the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Economist. He's written for peer-reviewed journals and academic publications. Just to talk about why I wanted to have you on the show, Jacob, my view is that the freedom of speech is little understood today, and it's very poorly defended. Here at the Ayn Rand Institute, where I work, we've been committed to intellectual freedom and free speech for decades. Going back to 1980s, we've been championing this principle. We spoke out after the Iranian fatwa against the British novelist Salman Rushdie some 30 years ago, and ever since, including after the attacks in Charlie Hebdo and everything in between. And I wanted to have you on the show, Jacob, after I came across some of your writings, and I was impressed by the strong defense of freedom of speech that you articulate. So I wanted to get your perspective on how things stand today, particularly in Europe. So Jacob, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks a lot for having me. I've looked forward to it.
So a little word about you. So I understand you're the founder and executive director of a think tank in Copenhagen, where you're based, called Justitia. And I think you mentioned in one of your podcasts, and you have a podcast, which I'll talk about in a minute, that you're the author of a book on the history of freedom of expression in Denmark. But I believe that's only available in Danish. Is that right?
That, unfortunately, is correct. And it's 1,100 pages, so I don't expect it to be translated into English anytime soon.
Okay, well, if that does happen, I'd love to take a look. And so I mentioned your podcast. So you write and narrate the show called Clear and Present Danger, which is a history of freedom of speech. So, I thought a good place to start is just if you could tell us a bit about how you got involved in advocating for freedom of speech, writing about it, and just how that integrated with your career background.
Yeah, so like you said, I'm a lawyer by training and background. I actually worked initially in corporate law, doing private equity, but I was always interested in writing and writing about human rights and civil liberties, and I'm very much a child of the cartoon crisis. I think that was what formed and shaped my views about free speech, because suddenly cozy liberal Denmark, where I was brought up and where I've spent most of my life, became sort of the epicenter of a global battle of values or on the relationship between free speech and religion. And like most Danes, and I think at the time most people living in liberal democracies in the West, I didn't really think about free speech. Obviously, I was in favor of free speech, but I didn't have to think about it because it was as natural as breathing the air, and there were very few controversies about free speech. But then suddenly the cartoon crisis thrust it on to the foreground of everything. And what I saw really stunned me, because you had many of those who saw themselves as the heirs of Enlightenment thinkers who had been championing free speach. I mean, we can come back to whether our Enlightenment heroes, all of them, really were as principled as we like to imagine. But they had at least made a very strong defense of free speech in their times. But now, intellectuals, journalists, editors, many of whom live by exercising their right to free speech, were suddenly saying, well, we have to be careful about free speech, and you shouldn't use free speech to offend the religious feelings of minorities, even though we lived in a society where Christianity could be openly mocked, which has not always been the case, because not many people think about it, but Denmark was actually one of the most repressive states not that many centuries ago, when it was a Lutheran Orthodox state. So really the ability to criticize religion has been really important for Denmark's status as a liberal democracy.
So you mentioned you describe yourself as a child of the cartoons crisis. So for us, I remember it very vividly. It had a big impact on me. I'm interested in hearing a bit about just for people who either weren't paying attention or weren't aware of it, or just too young to remember it. Just what are the key events that happened? Because the way it's remembered is some newspaper in Denmark decided to rile up a mob. They published these nasty cartoons, and I'm biasing this, and then a whole bunch of people rioted, and they were justified in their indignation. So what actually happened? What are the key events that we have to remember here?
Yeah, so there had been sort of debates about to which degree you could actually write or publish something that was quote unquote blasphemous towards Islam, because there had been incidents, journalists, publishers, writers who said that they were afraid of challenging Islam or Islamic dogmas because of threats from Islamists. And of course, Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands had been killed in the streets by an Islamist in 2004. So there were all these incidents, and then Flemming Rose, who was the cultural editor at the time at Jyllands-Posten, commissioned these cartoons as sort of an experiment to say, you know, and I think it's very important to take into context what he was not, you know, he was often portrayed as an Islamophobe and someone who was an anti-Muslim bigot. But if you read his text, the accompanying text, it was clear that what he said was, listen, you know, if we have to live together, you know, in a diverse society with people of different religious and ethnic backgrounds, you know, there has to be equality before the law. So either we can say, you know, I respect your taboo and you respect mine, and then, you know, we limit free speech across the board, or, you know, in a liberal society, and I'm not, you know, liberal as in a classical liberal way, you know, you have to suffer people expressing ideas that violate your taboos. And so that was his basic ideas. And initially not a lot happened, but then you had a group of imams here in Denmark who traveled around the Middle East and pushed governments in Egypt and other places into making this into an issue of international politics, putting pressure on Denmark. You know, Danish embassies in Syria were burned down. You know, and some of these governments clearly use this to bolster their own credentials among Islamists in their countries, like in Syria, where, you know, you couldn't just normally a mob would never be allowed to demonstrate, but then the regime said, well, you know, if we allow them to demonstrate against Denmark in these cartoons, you know, we'll look good with the Islamists who might otherwise threaten us. And it was taken up at the UN, and there were riots killing scores of people around the world, and many of the cartoonists and editors here in Denmark still live with around-the-clock surveillance.
So what was the I met Flemming. He's an acquaintance. He's a hero of mine. We've had events with him. I'm curious, what was the reaction of the Danish government, Danish intellectuals? Because you mentioned a little bit that there was some pushback. What was that like?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm generalizing here, but you could say that in general, many on the center left were very critical because they saw, they interpreted the cartoons as being part of a anti-Muslim agenda. And we've had a very fierce debate about integration and Islam in Denmark, which sometimes has been very heated and polemical. I tend to think that those kinds of debates are good, not because I sympathize with everything that's been said, but I just think that it's better to have these honest discussions about polarizing questions. And then suddenly, because they're bitter political enemies or opponents, might be a better word, they couldn't bring themselves to sort of see this as a question of free speech. They saw it in a very different light. And then also the idea, the multiculturalist idea that because Muslims are a minority in Denmark, there should be different standards, which I don't think, I don't think that's a strong argument in any case, because, you know, all Muslims are not the same. So I tend to prefer to think of people as individuals and not belonging to sort of groups that are defined by certain characteristics. But that was not the prevailing thought among many on the center left. The Danish government generally stood firm. There was no outright apology. I think our prime minister did go on Arab TV and became borderline apologetic. But I mean, we're a small country. It's a country of less than 6 million inhabitants. And, governments are always going to be sensitive, when suddenly you have threats from, Danes on Al-Qaeda death lists, huge corporations being boycotted in the Middle East, lots of pressure. And, go to the initial White House statement. And I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something equating the cartoons with hate speech or racial hatred. During the Bush presidency, the European Union made some statements that were also, Amnesty International made statements that were very equivocal. So I thought that this really was a betrayal of the idea of free speech, and it's not that, there's nothing wrong with being offended by cartoons that you perceive to be sacrilegious or violating your religious feelings. You and I probably have ideas that, and sensibilities that can be offended if someone says something that we disagree with. That's a very human thing. I think it would be unhuman if we were not offended. It's probably even a good thing sometimes. It's just that no one has a right not to be offended, and no one in particular has a right to enforce, their norms of offense on others. And I think that's a very, very important norm to uphold in a free and open society. And I think that was that huge segments of intellectuals, not only in Denmark, also elsewhere, were saying, were willing to give up that ideal and that principle at the time. And that was important to me.
I want to turn to a related issue, which is sort of the climate now in Europe, but just with one particular issue, which is, I read in one of your articles, and then I read elsewhere, that it was surprising to me, because we think of Denmark as you said, as a liberal democracy, or a very modern kind of advanced society. And yet up until, I think it was 2017, Denmark had a law on the books forbidding blasphemy.
Yes.
And one, I find that fascinating. It's sort of anachronistic. It's, places that actually have blasphemy are like Pakistan or Iran or many other countries where it's a serious issue. So what was the story there, and was it enforced? I mean, were people punished for blasphemy, and what kind of cases were going on?
Yeah, so that's true. It was abolished in 2017. We can come back perhaps on how and why. So the law against the blasphemy ban has long and very illiberal roots in Denmark. So it goes back to probably the 16th or 17th century, where it was decapitation and having your tongue cut out. That was moderated, obviously, but I think the last conviction was in 1946. The last prosecution was in 1971, until 2017, when a man was charged with burning the Quran. And like as I mentioned, I wrote this book about the history of free speech in Denmark. So I knew that there had been a Danish artist who in 1997 had burned the Bible in the news, live on the news, like, I don't know, the equivalent of NBC news report. And there had been complaints, and our chief prosecutor had rejected this charging this person, saying, this is part of freedom of expression. So that, to me seemed like a double standard, or that the blasphemy ban was sort of being revived again. And then, to their credit, a very leftist party, which is basically a party which is made up of former communist and socialist parties and groups, proposed a bill abolishing the blasphemy ban in Parliament. And after a lot of wrangling, our center-right government of the time decided to support it. Only the Social Democrats voted against.
And I believe, am I right in thinking that you had some role in advocating for the abolition?
Yeah, so I mean, it's something that I've been advocating for a long time. Not because, I mean, it would be disingenuous to say that the blasphemy ban had, a huge effect on the climate of free speech in Denmark, because, as I said, up until 2017, no one had been convicted since '46, and no one charged since 1971. But what it did do was legitimize blasphemy bans in countries like Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia. And this is not just a theoretical argument. This is something that you saw in documents from the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, who had long launched this campaign at the United Nations of defamation of religion that was defeated by the Obama administration in 2011 at the UN. But then they changed their tactics and said, okay, so blasphemy should basically reinterpret it to become hate speech. And so these countries, where some of them have the death penalty formally, at least for blasphemy, said, yeah, well, what's the problem? Because, countries like Denmark and Ireland have blasphemy bans. We have the same. We might not interpret it in the same manner, and our punishments might be somewhat harsher, but the principle of blasphemy, is accepted, both in the liberal West and here. So in that sense, I thought the Danish blasphemy ban was failing, religious minorities, both Muslims, Christians, Baha'is, others in particularly in the Islamic world who were being oppressed by blasphemy bans, in the same way that, if you go back in Enlightenment and pre-Enlightenment times in Europe, religious dissenters were being brutally suppressed by blasphemy bans in the Christian West.
I wanted to zoom out a bit and talk about, so you mentioned that when Jyllands Posten, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, published the cartoons, it was an experiment to see what the climate was in the culture. So I want to zoom out and look at that question, what your take is on the climate around free speech now, all these years after. And in particular, I'm interested in, I read about this case at the European Court of Human Rights, and I wanted to get a sense of, first of all, I think this case, this Austrian woman.
Yeah.
So what was the issue, and then sort of what was the reaction to it? Because to me, it seems like it's an indicator of where things are in terms of how people think about freedom of speech.
Yeah. So we have the European Court of Human Rights is sort of the top human rights court in Europe. It has jurisdiction over 47 member states of the Council of Europe. And its judgments are legally binding. And so you had a woman in Austria who had held these seminars on Islam. I don't think she was necessarily an authority on Islam. I don't think her lectures were necessarily unbiased. I think she was very critical of Islam. But she said that basically called the Prophet Muhammad a pedophile because, according to tradition, he married Aisha as a child and also consummated the marriage while she was, at least by modern standards, a child. So by modern standards, the charge of pedophilia would technically be correct, and we can have a discussion on whether it makes sense to judge someone from the 7th century according to our standards. But this was seen as violating Austria's law against religious insults. So she was fined, a mild fine, but nonetheless. And she took it to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights said that this was not a violation of freedom of expression because it has a doctrine in which freedom of religion and freedom of expression clash. They are not always complementary values, two sides of the same coin, if you like. They clash. So your religious freedom can actually be violated by someone's expression. Now, that to me is a deeply regressive idea. It has to be said that it's not only in the case of Islam. So you've had cases before, also in Austria, where the Catholic Church has been able to. So there was a satirical film about Christianity, and in Austria that was being screened at a private cinema. The Catholic Church was unhappy about it, and the police came and confiscated the film. And the European Court of Human Rights, in that case, also said that this was not a violation of free speech. But so to Americans who are sort of born and raised with the First Amendment, this is almost incomprehensible. Yeah, so I think that's a very regressive idea. I think this idea that tolerance requires self-censorship is a misguided form of tolerance that really turns the insides of people like Spinoza, for instance, on their head. He basically says all the way back in 1670, Spinoza says, he points to Amsterdam. Amsterdam is a city where people of different backgrounds live together, and we have to remember that it's not long ago that there's been a conflict with Spain, and you've had huge wars between Catholics and Protestants. But he says freedom of expression, freedom of conscience is the precondition for coexistence in society, and basically the European Court of Human Rights turns that on its head and says, if we are to live together, we need to respect certain taboos, and I think that's a dangerous development.
So, I mean, is it? I don't know if there's enough data to form a view of how things stand, but it seems like there is maybe more of a climate of self-censorship on certain topics. So I know it's not only Islam, but it seems like Islam is salient as something that people don't want to get near. I mean, the example that comes to mind is, I forget exactly when this happened, but there was an editor at Jyllands-Posten who said, we, just as a matter of policy, can't afford to publish anything critical of Islam because we can't afford it. And just security-wise, we've had so many affronts and so on. And they just said, look, we're being open about this. We're afraid to publish. So which I think is an unusual position to take. It's better to be open about it and say, look, we don't feel safe. But I think I wonder how many more publications or intellectuals are just not saying something because they're thinking of the risk and they don't want to face that risk.
Yeah, so I would say in general, you can be very critical of Islam in Denmark. You can certainly write stuff, and you see that every day in the media. You even see some ugly stuff that crosses over from being critical of Islam into outright anti-Muslim bigotry. But what you don't see in sort of legacy media, or at least very rarely, is the republication of the cartoons. That is, and now many editors are simply open about it, saying, we can't publish that because it's we have the responsibility. So there was this plot at once where some jihadists plotted breaking into Jyllands-Posten, decapitating journalists and throwing them onto a square, like a huge square in Denmark. So, for you and I to sit here and talk about free speech as a principle is easy, but once you're the editor and you have to think about the lives of your journalists, I can understand why I hope I would have the courage to choose a different strategy, but you can understand why, and I respect people who are afraid when they acknowledge openly that they're afraid, rather than using sort of these weasel words saying, "Oh, I do it out of respect," or something like that. But I would say that so I'm just finishing an episode on my podcast on the 1790s in the Dutch Republic and also in Britain. And so the 1790s was a horrible decade for free speech. Free speech has generally made huge gains in the 18th century, but then with the French Revolution, there was a huge backlash against free speech across the board. Even in the United States in 1798 with the Sedition Act, where critics of John Adams were imprisoned. And in Britain, you had a very famous case against Thomas Paine, and you had basically a witch hunt against reformers. You should always be careful about historical analogies, but I do see a bit of the same tendencies today. Not so much, or not only about Islam, but in general. I think the power of social media has really freaked out governments in Europe. So we have seen, for instance, Germany adopt a law that requires social media companies to remove illegal content within 24 hours or risk huge fines. We have seen France adopt something along the same lines, also adopt a law against fake news during election campaigns. So and the general climate. So if you look, for instance, at Freedom House's measurement of press freedom, there's been a decline for more than a decade. And I think in the past 4 or 5 years, that liberal democracies have contributed to it. And the UK's latest anti-terrorism law says something along the lines that if you express an opinion that can be interpreted as supportive of a terrorist organization, and if you said so recklessly, then you can be convicted. And if you access terrorist content, even without having terrorist intent. So if you sit at home and you want to watch, what's the deal with the PKK or ISIS? You watch that video, you could go to jail for up to 15 years. That to me is extremely draconian. And incompatible with any notion of freedom of expression. So I do see a great backlash against free speech, against the principle of free speech, even by the very states, democracies who should be the ones who championing this freedom. And I think also, to a large extent, you see that it's very interesting when newspapers, for instance, started emerging. They were, a lot of people saw them in the same way that they look at social media today, that they were these that where you had all kinds of garbage and fake news and so on, and so you see that in the legacy media today. You see that among politicians, and to a large extent, maybe it's because we take free speech for granted, because in many Western countries, we haven't really had to fight for freedom of expression. We were born with it as a right, and it's very difficult for us to imagine it not being part of our lives. So we imagine we can just, take a slice here, take a slice there, and nothing will happen.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join me today and tell us about your perspective on things in Europe. I wanted to thank you, and just to ask, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about your work?
Yeah, so I will probably go to freespeechhistory.com, which is the home of my podcast on the history of free speech, which chronicles the history of free speech all the way from the ancient Athenian democracy, the trial of Socrates, up until hopefully the modern era. But we're just about wrapping up the 18th century, so we've still got some time to go.
Okay. Well, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.